The Nevada desert stretched endlessly, a canvas of golden sand and cracked earth, where heat shimmered like a restless spirit. The air was dry enough to sting the throat, and every breath carried the faint taste of dust. Sunlight hammered down, with merciless intensity, bouncing off rocks, rifles, and sweat-slick helmets. The firing range, marked by weathered wooden posts and distant silhouettes of steel targets, lay quiet for a moment, waiting to come alive. The Navy SEALs had gathered there for what was supposed to be just another training exercise. They were men used to pressure, used to breaking limits, and they carried themselves with a confidence that bordered on arrogance. They had spent their lives doing what most believed impossible, diving into hostile waters, storming fortified compounds, and enduring tests designed to shatter the body and mind. Out here, on a firing line in Nevada, they were kings of the desert, and their laughter carried easily across the sand. At the far end of the range, nearly invisible to the untrained eye, a steel plate gleamed faintly in the sunlight. It was placed farther than most shooters would even attempt. The heat waves made it waver and blur, as if daring anyone to claim it was real at all. For the SEALs, the distance was a joke, a challenge that existed purely to be dismissed. One of them, a broad-shouldered petty officer with a sunburned neck and a grin that carried more swagger than kindness, tilted his chin toward the plate. "No one can hit that far," he said, voice loud enough for the group to hear. His words carried the weight of certainty. Heads nodded. Some chuckled. A few crossed their arms, grins spreading across their faces. To them, the plate was a taunt, a symbol of human limits. The bullet drop alone would make the attempt laughable, and the desert winds shifting, without warning, would punish arrogance. Their world was full of feats, but even they believed this was beyond reach. Yet, at the edge of the group, one man remained quiet. He wasn't part of the SEALs. His uniform marked him differently. A Marine sniper, Staff Sergeant Daniel Carter. He carried himself with the calm gravity of someone who had seen too much to need words. While the SEALs stood in loose groups, laughing and trading jokes, Carter crouched near his pack, checking his equipment. His movements were deliberate, unhurried, almost meditative. Carter wasn't a man who chased attention. In fact, he avoided it. His life had been built in silence, on rooftops overseas and ridgelines, where he had lain for hours, sometimes days, waiting for the right shot. He had seen what happened when arrogance replaced patience. He had seen missions collapse because someone thought impossible meant unlikely. To him, impossible was just a question of math, time, and discipline. The SEALs noticed his silence. One of them smirked, nudging the man beside him. "Bet the Marine thinks he can take it," he said. The group chuckled again, their amusement growing. They knew Carter's reputation. Marines prided themselves on their sniper program, their legends of long-distance kills, stories told in hushed tones by those who had fought alongside them. But stories were one thing. This plate, sitting out there against the Nevada heat, was something else. Carter didn't rise to the bait. He didn't need to. Instead, he reached into his pack and pulled free his rifle, the weapon gleaming under. The desert sun, it wasn't flashy. The rifle bore the marks of use, scratches along the stock, worn paint on the barrel. But it had character, the kind of character that came from years of service. Every scratch carried a memory, every dent a story. He set it down with care, the bipod legs clicking into place against the hard-packed earth. Around him, the desert seemed to grow quieter. He checked his scope, adjusted his dials, and let his fingers run across the rifle as though reacquainting himself with an old friend. His breathing slowed, his shoulders loosening. The SEAL who had first spoken folded his arms. "You seriously gonna try that?" he asked, amusement dripping from his tone. The others watched closely now, curiosity mingling with doubt. They wanted to see him fail. They wanted confirmation that some things were truly beyond reach. Carter didn't answer. Instead, he reached into a small pouch and pulled out a strip of cloth. He held it lightly, letting the desert breeze catch it, watching how it shifted. It was an old habit, something he had done countless times in combat zones. The cloth told him what the desert air whispered, a subtle push of wind that would carry a bullet off course if ignored. The SEALs shook their heads. To them, it looked theatrical, as if Carter were trying to put on a show. They didn't understand that these small rituals were survival, not performance. For Carter, the steel plate wasn't just a challenge. It was a reminder. He remembered nights in Afghanistan, lying on cold rocks, his body aching from stillness, waiting for one chance to protect his brothers. He remembered pulling the trigger, not for pride, but because someone's life depended on it. Every shot he took carried weight. Every shot mattered. Here in Nevada, surrounded by men who thrived on daring, Carter felt none of their bravado. He felt only the familiar calm before the shot. The range officer, standing nearby with arms crossed, raised an eyebrow. He had seen countless shooters miss at this distance, some giving up after a few tries, others never daring. "You sure you want that plate, Marine?" he asked. Carter finally spoke, his voice steady and quiet. "I didn't come here to miss." The words weren't loud, but they carried. The SEALs went silent for a beat, then laughter broke out. Again, some clapped each other on the shoulders, shaking their heads. They thought it was confidence, arrogance even. But Carter wasn't boasting. He was stating fact born of discipline, training, and trust in his craft. As he adjusted his scope, the world narrowed. The desert faded, the laughter dimmed, the sun's blaze softened. Through the glass, the plate stood waiting, far beyond reason, but perfectly clear in his mind. He slowed his breathing, chest rising, and falling with precision, each inhale a countdown, each exhale a release. Behind him, the SEALs grew restless. Some leaned forward, eager to witness the attempt. Others crossed their arms, already preparing to smirk when the shot went wide. Carter didn't notice. His world had already shrunk to a single circle of clarity in the scope. The desert stretched into mathematics. The wind mapped like an old companion. His finger brushed the trigger lightly, testing the weight, feeling the exact point where pressure would release steel and fire. For the SEALs, this was a spectacle. For Carter, it was simply another day, another test of patience and skill. And as the desert heat pressed down, the steel plate waited. Staff Sergeant Daniel Carter worked like a craftsman, not a showman. Every movement carried a purpose, practiced until it looked effortless. He didn't rush. He didn't need to. While the Navy SEALs shifted their weight, restless in the desert heat, Carter knelt in the dirt and laid out his tools as though he were arranging sacred instruments. The rifle came first, an M40A6 he had carried for years. It wasn't factory new or polished for show. It bore the honest wear of deployment. A scratch near the stock reminded him of a fall on an Afghan ridgeline. A nick near the bolt handle came from a rushed reload during an ambush outside Fallujah. To anyone else, the imperfections marked a weapon's decline. To Carter, they were a language, proof of survival. Next came the strip of cloth. Faded from sun and sweat, it looked like nothing more than a rag. But in Carter's hands, it became his first instrument of truth. He held it lightly and let the desert air catch it. The cloth danced in uneven patterns, twitching left then right, fluttering before it stilled again. Carter's eyes didn't just see the movement, they measured it. In his mind, he translated flutter into numbers, numbers into corrections, corrections into a path for the bullet. The seals muttered among themselves, voices carrying in the stillness. "He's doing magic tricks," one said, smirking. "Or pretending to," another replied. A third added, "Guy thinks this is a movie." They didn't understand. They lived in a world where distance meant closing in, where problems were solved by direct action, not by patience stretched across miles. Sniping was foreign to them, an art of invisibility and restraint. Carter wasn't offended by their misunderstanding. He had heard it all before. He had been underestimated more times than he could count. And more often than not, those who dismissed him were the ones left staring in silence when steel rang or when enemies fell without ever seeing who ended them. Carter tucked the cloth away and pulled a small, battered notebook from his pocket. The cover was frayed, corners softened, from years of use. Inside, neat columns of numbers filled the pages. Distance charts, wind adjustments, elevation data. Every line represented hours of study, trials in desert heat, mountain cold, and jungle humidity. He flipped to a page marked with pencil smudges and began running calculations in his head, lips moving faintly. The seal closest to him snorted. "He's doing math in the middle of the desert. This guy serious?" Carter ignored him. His mind was already elsewhere, halfway across the range, picturing the bullet's arc through shimmering heat. He saw the invisible obstacles, the wind shear, the thermal updrafts, the drop over distance. He wasn't just imagining the shot, he was living it in advance. The desert reminded him of Afghanistan. The heat pressed against his skin in the same relentless way, and the silence carried the same weight. He remembered a night on a ridgeline above the Korangal Valley. His platoon had been pinned down, caught in a crossfire they couldn't escape. Carter had lain flat on the rocks, chest pressed against the ground, watching through his scope as enemy fighters moved like shadows below. The distance had been extreme, farther than most dared to attempt, but failure wasn't an option. Every second he hesitated, men bled. He had taken the shot, heart steady, breath controlled. When the target dropped, his platoon found the space to move, to survive. No one cheered. There was no celebration. But when dawn came, the men looked at him differently. Respect had been earned, not through words, but through a silent equation written in lead. That memory stayed with him now as he worked in the Nevada desert. The SEALs could laugh. They could dismiss him, but Carter knew the truth. He didn't need to convince anyone. The steel plate at the end of the range would either fall silent or shatter loud. That was all that mattered. He adjusted his scope, fingers precise, dial clicking softly in the quiet. Elevation corrected, windage accounted for, distance calculated. Every detail fed into a rhythm he had carried for years. Some shooters treated their rifles like tools. Carter treated his like a partner. Together, they had walked through chaos and returned alive. The range officer walked by, watching Carter work. He didn't interrupt, didn't offer advice. He had seen men like this before, the ones who moved with calm that couldn't be faked. The officer glanced at the SEALs, still laughing among themselves, then looked back at Carter. He said nothing, but his eyes betrayed curiosity. Carter lay flat against the ground, rifle settled into his shoulder. The dirt pressed against his chest, hot and unyielding. He adjusted his cheek weld, finding the perfect alignment behind the scope. Through the glass, the world transformed. The heat haze rippled, but the steel plate sat steady, a white square against the blur. He inhaled deeply, slow and deliberate, filling his lungs. He held it, counting silently, then exhaled. The rhythm calmed his pulse, slowed his thoughts, narrowed his focus. Around him, the desert could have vanished, the SEALs could have disappeared, and it wouldn't have mattered. His world was now only him, the rifle, and the plate. Behind him, the seals grew louder, sensing the moment. Bet he misses by a mile. Bet he doesn't even hear it hit dirt. You're on $50, says he can't touch it. Their voices were background noise, unimportant. Carter had long ago learned to tune out distractions. He had once taken a shot while mortar rained down around him, the concussions shaking his very bones. He had once lined up a target while helicopters thundered overhead and tracer fire stitched the sky. Compared to that, a few jeers in the desert were nothing. What mattered now was patience. Patience had saved him more than once. He thought of another night in Iraq, lying still in the sand as insurgents scoured the area with flashlights. 3 hours he hadn't moved a muscle, waiting for one man to step into view. When the shot finally came, it had ended the ambush before it began. His team never knew how close they had been to disaster. They only knew Carter was steady when it mattered. That steadiness filled him now. His hands didn't tremble. His breath didn't hitch. His mind didn't wander. He was here, present, precise. The SEALs didn't understand, not yet, but they would. Carter settled low into the dust, his body folding naturally into the earth, as though the desert had always been his second home. The rifle rested on its bipod, barrel stretching forward like a spear pointed across time. He nudged the stock into his shoulder until the pressure felt right firm, unyielding, like the embrace of a trusted friend. His cheek touched the comb, and instantly his vision narrowed to the scope. The world outside disappeared. The SEAL's laughter faded. The relentless sun became nothing more than light filtered through glass. In Carter's eye, there was only a circle of magnified truth, the desert floor rippling with heat, mirages, dancing like ghosts, and at the center, almost swallowed by haze, the steel plate waiting. Heat waves distorted its edges, making the square shimmer as though it were a mirage about to vanish. Carter had seen such tricks before. In Afghanistan, heat mirages had made men look like shifting shadows, figures stretching and collapsing, until nothing seemed real. But he had learned how to see through lies the earth told. Beneath the distortion, he fixed on the plate's center. His breathing slowed, measured, each inhale a tide swelling, each exhale a tide retreating. He had trained himself to fire between heartbeats, to let his body become a steady platform no matter how adrenaline surged. Through the scope, he could see dust devils spiraling lazily, small warnings of unseen wind currents. He didn't curse them. He respected them, accounted for them. They were part of the equation. The SEALs leaned forward now, drawn despite themselves into the ritual of a sniper shot. To them, this was a spectacle, a gamble. To Carter, it was a conversation between man, rifle, and distance. He adjusted the scope dials, fingers moving without hesitation. Clicks echoed softly. Elevation, windage, parallax. Numbers he had memorized, long ago lined up with the realities of this day. He factored distance against bullet drop, crosswinds against spin drift, air density against muzzle velocity. The math wasn't written down. It lived inside him, a language he spoke fluently after years of failure, correction, and repetition. Look at him, one SEAL whispered. Like he's painting a picture. Another chuckled. Yeah, a picture of a miss. Carter didn't flinch. He remembered nights when noise had been far worse. Mortar shells had screamed overhead. RPGs had detonated close enough to rain debris on his position. Men had screamed orders, prayers, or both, yet he had stayed steady. Compared to that, this desert banter was silence. His mind drifted briefly to a mountain in Helmand province. He had lain in frozen stillness for 12 hours, watching an enemy commander move between bunkers. Every muscle had begged to shift, to ease the ache, but he hadn't moved. When the target finally appeared in the open, Carter had placed a single round through the man's chest at nearly a mile. That shot hadn't earned him glory. It had earned his platoon a reprieve, a chance to live another day. Now in Nevada, he carried that same steadiness. The SEALs expected him to miss. That didn't matter. This wasn't for them. It was for the principle of precision itself. His finger brushed the trigger guard, resting lightly, testing weight and position. He didn't squeeze yet. He waited, letting his body align with the rifle until man and machine blurred. He whispered silently in his mind, not words, but numbers. Distance, drift, drop, Coriolis. To an outsider, it would have seemed obsessive. To Carter, it was prayer. The range grew still, as though the desert itself held its breath. Even the SEALs' chatter quieted, curiosity overtaking mockery. They leaned in, eyes narrowing, waiting for the sound. Through the scope, Carter's world shrank even further. The plate was no longer just steel. It was memory. It was every comrade who had trusted his aim. Every moment when missing had not been an option. It was nights in hostile valleys, waiting for movement that never came, and days when one shot changed the outcome for everyone. His chest rose, fell. Inhale. Exhale. Pause. The shot lived in that pause. Carter knew the bullet's journey before he fired. He could see the arc in his mind, the invisible curve drawn by gravity, the way the wind would push, the time it would take before impact. He wasn't imagining. He was calculating reality. Behind him, one SEAL whispered, "He's not gonna." But the words were cut short by the silence, the kind that only came when everyone leaned into the same moment. Carter's finger moved to the trigger. He felt its familiar resistance, the precise wall before the break. Years of practice had taught him to respect that wall, to dance on its edge without crossing until the moment was right. His lungs emptied. Again, and in that stillness between breaths, between heartbeats, between seconds, he knew it was time. The SEALs shifted on their feet, sensing something. The air felt charged, like the moment before lightning. Carter didn't blink. He didn't waver. His mind, body, and rifle were one. And then, the trigger broke with a crisp, almost delicate click. For Carter, it was the sound of finality, the moment when all the preparation, all the math, all the patience transformed into action. The rifle spoke an instant later, a sharp crack that ripped through the desert air, louder than any voice, louder than doubt itself. Dust puffed from the ground around him, disturbed by the recoil. The stock kicked against his shoulder, a familiar jolt he had long ago learned to absorb. The SEALs flinched as the rifle's roar echoed, some instinctively leaning back, others tilting forward to follow the invisible path of the bullet. The desert swallowed the sound quickly, returning them to silence, as though the earth itself demanded respect for what had just begun. Carter remained still. His finger eased off the trigger, his breathing unchanged, his eye never leaving the scope. To him, the shot wasn't finished. Pulling the trigger was only the beginning. The bullet was still alive, still in motion, still carving its invisible arc through the heat. Across the range, the air shimmered. The bullet traveled faster than thought, a supersonic messenger cutting through layers of resistance. Air density, shifting currents, gravity's pull. Carter could almost feel its flight in his bones, as if some tether connected him to it, stretching thin across the desert. He imagined it slicing through the mirage, a perfect curve against impossible odds. The SEALs waited, squinting into the distance. Seconds stretched unnaturally long. They expected instant gratification, immediate impact, immediate clang of steel. But long-distance shooting didn't work that way. The farther the target, the longer the silence between cause and effect. It was a silence that tested patience, a silence that revealed who understood the art and who didn't, missed. One seal muttered prematurely, shaking his head. Nothing. Carter didn't react. He knew better. He knew the bullet was still traveling, still closing the impossible gap. He trusted his calculations, trusted his instincts honed by years. When missing hadn't been an option. The shot wasn't over until the plate answered. Time warped. Each second felt like an eternity. The desert stretched into an endless void, empty except for the faint shimmer of the distant target. The seals shifted uncomfortably. Some began, whispering, their confidence faltering under the weight of the silence. Carter's mind, however, was calm. He had lived inside these silences before. In combat zones, every long shot came with this same breathless weight. He remembered lying on a mountainside in Afghanistan, pulling the trigger on a target half a mile away. The bullet had taken nearly 3 seconds to reach its mark. In those 3 seconds, his world had been the same as now. Stillness, trust, patience. And as now, he hadn't blinked. Through the scope, he kept his focus steady. The plate wavered in the heat, ghost-like, as if daring him to believe it existed. The mirage played tricks, making the square ripple, grow, and shrink. He ignored the illusions. He saw only the truth beneath them. The silence deepened. The seals grew restless. One laughed too loudly, trying to mask unease. Told you. No one can hit that far. Still, Carter waited. And then, a spark of dust erupted at the plate's edge. The steel shuddered visibly. A dark crater appearing near its center. A fraction of a second later, the sharp metallic crack rang across the desert, echoing back to the firing line. The delay between sight and sound slammed into the seals' minds with startling clarity. The bullet had traveled so far, so fast, that the proof of its strike arrived before the echo of Carter's rifle. The desert swallowed the echo, but the silence afterward was different now. It wasn't mocking, wasn't doubtful. It was heavy, filled with awe. Carter exhaled slowly, lowering his rifle with deliberate care. He didn't celebrate, didn't pump a fist or smirk. He simply treated the rifle as he always did, with quiet reverence. For him, the hit was expected. It wasn't arrogance, it was discipline, mathematics, and trust in years of training. The seals stood frozen. Their smirks had vanished, replaced by disbelief. One rubbed his eyes as if he had misseen. Another muttered, "No way. That didn't just happen," but it had. The steel plate bore the scar, undeniable proof. Carter dusted his palms lightly against his trousers, as though brushing away sand, and finally leaned back. The desert was still the same, sun blazing, wind shifting, heat shimmering. Yet for everyone watching, the world had changed. The bullet's journey lingered in their minds. They imagined it slicing through 2,000 yards of air, riding the thin line between science and art. They replayed the silence, that unbearable pause when nothing seemed certain. They remembered the way their confidence had cracked the instant steel rang. For the seals, men who thrived on proving limits. False, the moment rewrote the boundaries of what they thought possible. Carter, though, felt none of that weight. To him, the plate wasn't victory, it was practice. It was a reminder of every moment in combat when missing wasn't an option, when failure meant someone didn't come home. He didn't crave their admiration. He didn't even crave acknowledgement. He only craved the discipline to be perfect, again and again, whether anyone watched or not. Behind him, one seal whispered, almost reverently. The plate shattered before the echo came. The words carried, soft but undeniable, capturing the truth of what they had witnessed. The desert stood silent, scarred by the bullet's path, but alive with a new respect that none of them could ignore. The desert didn't move. The sun still burned, the wind still stirred faint dust along the ground, and the steel plate still stood upright. Yet everything had changed. The echo of the impact had barely died when the seals froze in disbelief. The sharp metallic crack replayed in their minds, over and over, refusing to let them deny what they had witnessed. The plate, once a distant speck, now bore a dark crater evidence carved in steel. It hadn't swayed gently. It hadn't given the faint ping of a grazing blow. It had been struck dead, solid, center. For a long moment, no one spoke. There. Silence was almost louder than the rifle's report. These were men who rarely held their tongues, warriors who thrived on banter and bravado, but now their voices deserted them. Carter lay still, cheek pressed against the rifle stock, eyes steady on the target through the scope. He had not moved except to release the trigger. His breathing flowed naturally, calm as a man resting on a porch rather than one who had just redefined the possible. Finally, he drew his head back, blinked against the desert glare, and lowered the rifle gently to the earth. He treated the weapon with the same care he always did, slow, precise, reverent. There was no grin, no triumphant gesture. He didn't seek their eyes. He brushed a thin layer of dust from his sleeve, as if the shot had been nothing more than routine. But for the SEALs, it was anything but routine. One finally broke the silence with a low whistle, the sound stretching across the line like wind through canyon walls. Another muttered, "No way." His voice cracked with disbelief. A third shook his head violently, as though the act itself might shake loose a better explanation. "Did you see that?" someone asked, even though everyone had. "Dead center," another answered, voice tinged with awe. Before the echo came a quieter voice, almost reverent. The group shifted uneasily, men who were not used to being caught without words. Their smirks had dissolved into slack-jawed stares. The mocking laughter that had filled the air earlier now seemed childish, ridiculous in hindsight. They had placed bets, whispered jokes, and dismissed the Marine with arrogance. Now their pride felt hollow, their certainty shattered along with the plate. Carter finally sat up, stretching his shoulders. His movements were unhurried, the motions of a man who had carried heavy packs across mountains and deserts until every joint learned patience. He reached for his canteen, took a measured sip of lukewarm water, and replaced the cap without hurry. To him, the hit wasn't remarkable. It was the result of repetition, thousands of hours, countless rounds, a lifetime of failure and correction. He didn't see the strike as magic. He saw it as inevitable. If the math was right, if the breathing was right, if patience held steady, then the bullet had no choice but to arrive. But the SEALs didn't live in that world. Their world was direct action, fast assaults, limits pushed in the moment through strength and aggression. Long-range shooting felt alien, like sorcery hidden behind glass. And now, seeing steel crumble from an impossible distance, they couldn't help but feel the weight of something beyond their frame of reference. One SEAL finally stepped closer, squinting at the Marine. "How the hell?" he began, then trailed off. The words felt too small. Carter didn't answer. He wasn't being rude. He simply knew there was no answer that would satisfy them. He could tell them about the wind calculations, the bullet drop, the spindrift, the temperature adjustments. He could walk them through every step of their preparation. But none of it would mean anything without the years of repetition behind. The endless failures stacked up until success became muscle memory. So instead, he remained quiet, letting the silence stretch. Another SEAL laughed nervously, rubbing the back of his neck. "Guess I owe somebody $50, he muttered, earning a few hollow chuckles from the others. But the humor didn't land. The desert was still too heavy with the weight of what they had seen. The range officer, who had stood quietly off to the side, finally spoke. His voice was calm, steady, but there was respect in it. "Not many can do that," he said simply. Carter nodded once, acknowledging the words without comment. He didn't seek praise. Praise had never saved a man in combat. Precision had. His mind drifted, unbidden, to another steel plate, though this one had been a man. Afghanistan again. A compound raid gone wrong. His unit pinned down by a sniper firing from a distant ridgeline. Carter had lain flat in the dust, calculating. Wind drift while bullets cracked overhead. When his shot landed, the enemy fire stopped, and his brothers had surged forward to finish the fight. No one had cheered then either. But afterward, a sergeant had clapped him on the shoulder with a look that said everything words could not. That was what this moment felt like. Not celebration, not triumph. Just confirmation that discipline still mattered. The SEALs, one by one, began to move closer, studying Carter as though expecting to see something extraordinary. But he was ordinary to look at. A man in desert fatigues, sweat streaking his brow, dust clinging to his sleeves. No aura, no theatrics, no secret. Just steadiness. Do it again, one finally said. Half a challenge, half a plea. Carter glanced up at him, expression unreadable. Not today, he answered. His tone was even final. He stood, brushed dust from his knees, and began packing his gear. The rifle went into its case with careful precision, the bipod folded, scope capped, each motion deliberate. To the SEALs, it seemed almost ritualistic, like a ceremony performed after a sacred act. To Carter, it was simple respect for the tool that had carried him through years of survival. The steel plate still stood at the far end of the range, scarred. By the crater his bullet had left. To the SEALs, it was a monument now, a symbol of humility, a reminder that some limits existed only in their minds. They would remember that scar for years. They would tell stories about it, each adding their own embellishment, but all circling the same undeniable truth. They had seen the impossible happen before their eyes. For Carter, the plate meant nothing more than proof of discipline. He didn't walk away taller. He didn't crave their stares. He packed his rifle, slung his pack, and took a slow breath of the hot desert air. The SEALs parted for him as he moved toward the edge of the range, silent now, their mockery replaced with something closer to reverence. None dared stop him. None dared joke. As Carter walked past, one whispered to another. The plate shattered before the echo came. The phrase carried again, as it had earlier, like a truth they couldn't shake. Carter didn't look back. The desert ahead stretched endlessly, and he walked into it with the same calm he always carried. Behind him, the SEALs stared at the scarred plate, the silence around them no longer empty, but full of respect, full of memory, full of the moment when doubt had been silenced by a single bullet. The steel plate remained at the far end of the range, scarred and silent, yet its presence dominated every thought. It wasn't just a target anymore. It had become a witness, a monument to what had just unfolded. The SEALs couldn't look away. Their glances kept drifting back to it, as though the crater might vanish if they didn't keep watch, as if proof itself might dissolve into the desert heat. Carter zipped the rifle case shut with deliberate calm, the rasp of the zipper oddly loud against the hush of the men around him. The SEALs formed a loose circle, no longer posturing, no longer smirking. Their silence was different, now not. The heavy pause of disbelief, but the charged quiet of curiosity straining at the edges. One of them finally stepped forward, folding his arms. "All right," he said, voice low but firm. "How?" Carter looked up, his eyes steady, his face unreadable. He didn't answer immediately. Instead, he adjusted the sling on his pack, checked the buckles, made sure every piece of gear was in its place. The delay wasn't deliberate arrogance. It was simply his rhythm. He had learned long ago that rushing never solved anything. "How?" The SEAL pressed again, impatience in his tone this time. "That wasn't luck. That wasn't just math. There's something else. What is it? Carter's gaze flicked across the group. Their expressions ranged from eager to frustrated, but all carried the same undercurrent. They needed to know. These were warriors, men who prided themselves on pushing limits, and now they had seen a limit fall before their eyes. To them, knowledge was survival. If there was a secret to what Carter had just done, they wanted it. He let the silence breathe. For a few moments longer, then finally spoke. "There's no secret," he said. His voice was calm, even, but it carried enough weight to still the restless shifting among them. "It's repetition, failure, and patience." The words hung in the air, unsatisfying to some, too simple for others. One of the SEALs scoffed quietly. "That's it? Failure and patience?" Carter's eyes fixed on him. "Every shot I've ever taken is built on 1,000 that didn't land," he replied. "Every hit is just the last step in a trail of misses. You don't get here by chasing perfection. You get here by surviving imperfection long enough to learn from it." The group fell quiet again. For men accustomed to glorifying success, the idea that mastery was born from endless failure wasn't what they expected. Carter crouched and brushed dust from his boots, but his mind had already slipped backward into the places his words had come from. He remembered the wind-swept ridges of Helmand, where shots stretched across valleys and mistakes could cost lives. He remembered the time he'd misjudged a gust, watched a round sail just wide of an enemy fighter, and felt his stomach twist as the man scrambled for cover. He remembered the reprimand from his team leader, not anger, just a heavy hand on the shoulder and a single word, "Again." Failure hadn't been the end. It had been the teacher. "You think I was born with this?" Carter asked suddenly, his voice breaking the stillness. "I wasn't. I missed. A lot. I missed when missing meant danger. I missed when missing meant men I cared about had to fight harder, bleed more. Every time I learned. Every time I came back to the rifle, not because I liked it, but because I owed it." The SEALs listened, leaning in slightly. This wasn't boasting. His tone carried no ego. If anything, it carried weight, the heaviness of memory, the residue of years when the stakes were paid in blood. One of them finally asked, quieter this time, "So why didn't you quit? After all that failure?" Carter's eyes narrowed slightly, his jaw tightening as though the answer carried pain. "Because quitting wasn't mine to choose. My job was to protect the men beside me. If I quit, they carried the weight. And that wasn't acceptable." The words landed hard, drawing nods from men who knew the same truth in their own ways. Brotherhood was a currency they all understood, no matter the uniform. Another SEAL knelt in the dust, studying Carter's face as though searching for cracks. "You make it sound like it's just discipline. But that shot," he pointed toward the distant plate, "that wasn't just discipline. That was something else. Intuition. Instinct. What do you call it?" Carter's eyes flicked toward the horizon, where heat shimmered endlessly. "Call it trust," he said finally. "Trust in the math. Trust in the wind. Trust in the hours you've already put in. And when the moment comes, trust in yourself enough not to flinch." He paused, letting the words settle, then added quietly, "Most people lose the shot before they pull the trigger. They second-guess. They panic. They think about missing. If you let doubt ride with you, the bullet will carry it all the way to the target." The SEALs absorbed the words, their silence respectful now. Carter finished securing his gear and rose slowly to his feet. The sun caught the edges of his face, casting shadows across lines carved by years of service, fatigue, and endurance. He wasn't larger than life. He wasn't a legend. He was simply a man who had endured enough to make the impossible look inevitable. The SEALs exchanged glances. The bravado that had filled the morning was gone. What replaced it was something quieter but far stronger: respect. Not just for the shot, but for the man who had made it. One finally extended a hand. "Semper Fi, Marine," he said softly. Carter shook it once, firm and brief. No smile, no nod, just acknowledgement. The circle loosened. Questions lingered on their faces, but none spoke them aloud. They had heard. Enough. Some truths couldn't be taught in words. Some could only be lived, repeated, failed, and endured until the lesson carved itself into bone. As Carter turned toward the desert, the phrase carried again on the wind, whispered by one of the younger SEALs almost unconsciously. The plate shattered before the echo came. This time, the words didn't sound like disbelief. They sounded like reverence. Carter walked on, leaving them with their thoughts. The scarred steel plate and the silence of the desert had now seemed less empty, more sacred. The desert heat still pressed down relentlessly, but the tension had shifted. It no longer belonged to the impossible shot, the distant steel plate, or the echo that hadn't yet returned. The tension now belonged to the SEALs themselves, circling. Carter as though drawn by gravity, their pride tempered by awe. They had come expecting entertainment, a spectacle, maybe even a laugh. Instead, they had witnessed mastery. The bullet had flown, and the plate had shattered, but the lesson was deeper: discipline, patience, trust. And now curiosity pressed hard against their disbelief. One stepped closer, helmet tipping back, eyes narrowed. "How do you do it?" he asked, voice low. "It's more than math, more than patience. I've seen snipers before, but this..." His words faltered. There was no language to capture what they had just witnessed. Carter, standing with the easy posture of a man accustomed to carrying weight, did not flinch. "You want to know how?" he asked quietly. The question wasn't rhetorical. It was real. He understood what they were asking, but he also knew the answer couldn't be handed over in words alone. "It's in the hours no one sees," he said. "The early mornings, the nights you lie still, sweating, aching, waiting for one chance. The mistakes that sting, the rounds you call wasted, the targets you miss when it matters most. You carry every miss forward. You carry it until it builds into something precise." The SEALs exchanged glances. One of them muttered, "Sounds like torture." Carter shook his head, eyes distant. "It's discipline, and discipline comes at a cost." He gestured vaguely toward the desert. "Every time you take a shot, you leave a piece of yourself behind. It's not just skill. It's patience, focus, memory, muscle control. And the cost isn't just physical. It's mental. It's every time you see someone get hurt because you hesitated or miscalculated." A quiet settled over the group. For men who thrived on risk, the cost of mastery had rarely been laid out so plainly. They understood danger, yes, but responsibility, like Carter's, it was different. It weighed on the soul as much as on the body. Carter knelt briefly, brushing dust from the rifle case, and his eyes caught the steel plate one last time. The scar left by his bullet glinted in the sunlight, a reminder of the line between life and death, success and failure. He had carried that line across deserts, mountains, and rooftops. Today, it had been carved into steel instead of human flesh. That made the moment quieter, safer, but no less instructive. The SEALs circled closer, their own weapons momentarily forgotten. One stepped forward and asked, "Do you ever miss?" Carter's gaze sharpened, his jaw tightening slightly. "Every day," he said. "Every shot I've ever fired, every calculation, every long-range attempt misses outnumber hits. But those misses are what make the hits possible. You carry them. You learn from them. You respect them." He paused, letting the words sink in. "And sometimes," he continued, voice lower now, "you lose people because you miscalculate. You can't forget that. You never do. That's why every shot matters. Every one. The SEALs looked at him, the weight of those words settling. These were men who had lived through fire, men who understood loss, but Carter's honesty made them feel it freshly. It wasn't abstract. It wasn't numbers or drills. It was human cost, carved into every movement, every heartbeat, every trigger pull. One of the younger SEALs, barely 23, spoke with a quiet reverence. I think I get it now. It's respect. Respect for the rifle, the wind, the distance, yourself. Carter's lips curved faintly in acknowledgement. Exactly, he said. Without respect, skill is meaningless. Pride, arrogance, luck, those will fail you before distance does. The group remained silent, absorbing the lesson. They began to test their own assumptions, shifting weight from foot to foot, imagining the impossibly long distance, imagining themselves in Carter's shoes. And in the silence, something changed. They no longer saw the Marine as competition, or as a novelty. They saw a man who had honed his craft at great cost and with great responsibility. Carter began packing the rifle, moving deliberately. Each movement was precise, economical, fluid. He folded the bipod, capped the scope, secured. The sling. It was a ritual he had performed countless times in worse conditions, under more stress, when stakes had been life itself. Today, he did it with calm, as though carving order from chaos was simply what one did. The SEALs watched him, almost hypnotized by the care he took. One muttered, every action, every second, it's all connected. Carter paused, looking up at them. What you saw out there, he said, gesturing to the distant plate, wasn't luck. It was preparation meeting patience, meeting opportunity. And if you don't respect each of those, it won't matter how strong, fast, or brave you are. You'll miss. A seasoned SEAL, arms crossed, nodded slowly. So it's not just about hitting the target. It's about surviving the responsibility. Carter nodded. Exactly. Every shot has consequences. Every movement you make matters. That's why you practice endlessly. Not for glory, not for validation, but because if you don't, someone else will pay the cost. The SEALs didn't need further explanation. They felt it, heavy in the desert air. Their laughter from earlier seemed shallow now, naive. They had witnessed precision. They had witnessed discipline. And they had glimpsed the weight it carried. One of the younger SEALs finally broke the silence, voice trembling slightly. I want to be that disciplined. I want to get there. But it's hard to even imagine. Carter gave him a level, unwavering gaze. It's not magic. It's patient work. It's failure. It's getting up every time you fall. It's trusting yourself enough to carry on, even when you can't see the result yet. You don't get it in a day. You get it in years. And even then, it's never perfect. That's why you respect every shot, every lesson, every error. The SEALs absorbed it. Some nodded slowly. Others simply stared, lost in thought. For the first time that day, they were silent not out of disbelief, but reflection. Carter slung the rifle over his shoulder, the case now heavy with the weight of spent rounds, memory, and responsibility. He walked toward the edge of the range. Not hurried, not triumphant, but steady and assured. As he moved, one of the SEALs muttered under his breath, almost to himself. The plate shattered before the echo came. This time, the words weren't spoken in disbelief, or awe, or casual repetition. They were a mantra, a quiet acknowledgement of the lesson they had been given. The impossibility had been made real, and with it, the meaning behind it. Carter glanced back only briefly, a subtle nod toward the men who had just witnessed the impossible. Then he walked on, leaving the desert quiet once again, leaving the scarred steel plate, and leaving the SEALs with the knowledge that some things discipline, Patience, trust, responsibility couldn't be taught in words. They had to be experienced. The sun dipped slightly lower, casting long shadows across the cracked earth, and the desert felt less empty now. It was alive with understanding, with memory, with the weight of human effort made visible. The seals remained where they stood, circling the plate like archaeologists around a relic, contemplating what they had seen and what it meant for them, for their craft, for the limits they had assumed existed. Carter's lesson had landed, and unlike the bullet, its impact would not fade with the desert wind. The desert wind whispered across the range, lifting grains of sand and carrying the faint metallic scent of spent rounds. The steel plate, scarred and battered, sat silent at the far end, its impact crater a testament to Carter's discipline. The seals lingered, drawn to it as though it were more than metal and emblem, a symbol, proof of the impossible achieved. Carter slung the rifle case over his shoulder, its weight familiar, comforting. Every buckle, strap, and clip clicked into place with deliberate calm. He walked slowly toward the edge of the range, each step measured, grounded. The heat pressed against his back, but he barely noticed. His mind was elsewhere, already moving past the accomplishment, past the echoes of disbelief, past the murmured respect of men who had just witnessed something they didn't fully understand. He thought of the countless mornings before dawn, lying in frost, dust, or sand, rifle in hand, waiting. He remembered the nights where exhaustion pulled him to the edge of failure, where hunger, cold, or fear clawed at him, but he could not move. He remembered friends lost, mistakes made, and victories that came at the cost of sweat, blood, and patience. All of it had built to this moment, and yet Carter felt no elation. Pride was a luxury he had learned to avoid. For him, mastery wasn't measured in applause, in astonished faces, or in shattered steel. It was measured in the quiet assurance that, if called upon, he could protect, endure, and succeed where others could not. The seals, still circling the plate, had begun talking again, but their voices were hushed, cautious. They were replaying the moment in their minds, trying to dissect it, trying to find some trick, some hidden secret. But there was none. Only repetition, patience, calculation, and trust. The kind of trust that came from living through every mistake and carrying its lesson forward. One of them finally called out, "Marine, you ever get tired of carrying?" "It all?" Carter didn't answer immediately. He considered the question. He thought of the years, the long deployments, the nights of silence, the weight of responsibility pressing constantly against his shoulders. The cost of precision was never zero. The human toll was never negligible. He had seen comrades fall because someone miscalculated, misjudged, or panicked, and he had learned to bear that weight without complaint, without bitterness. Finally, he spoke. "Every day," he said quietly, "every day you carry it. But that's the point. If you don't, someone else will pay the price. You carry it because it has to be carried. You carry it because it's your duty. And you carry it because you can." The seals nodded slowly. The younger ones shifted uncomfortably, realizing the depth of what he had just said. Mastery, discipline, and trust were not gifts. They were burdens. They came with sacrifice. They came with failure. And they came with the constant presence of responsibility. Carter looked back at the steel plate one last time. The desert shimmered, heat waves dancing across the cracked earth. He could still see the crater, still see the proof. To anyone else, it might have seemed like triumph. To him, it was simply data, an outcome that confirmed what he already knew. Patience, preparation, and respect for the craft would always outlast doubt, arrogance, and haste. He adjusted the rifle case on his shoulder, taking a deep breath. The desert smelled of dust and metal, but also of clarity, of truth unadorned by exaggeration. The SEALs watched silently, no one daring to interrupt. Some had attempted to question, to understand, but they already knew. Words could not teach what had been shown. Observation, reflection, and memory would carry the lesson forward. Carter's mind drifted briefly to his team overseas, men who had relied on him to see what others could not. He remembered the quiet weight of responsibility during night raids, the sleepless hours tracking distant movements, the long calculations that determined life or death. Each bullet fired had been a decision, each pause a lifetime of consequence. And still, the desert, the steel, the heat, and the wind had demanded the same discipline today. The SEALs, sensing him preparing to leave, straightened. One finally stepped forward, extending a hand again, this time with more reverence than before. "Semper Fi, Marine," he said softly, echoing the words of respect that Carter had earned without seeking them. Carter shook it, firm but brief. No smile, no words of encouragement. The handshake was acknowledgement, not praise. It was enough. He began walking away, boots crunching against gravel and sand. Behind him, the desert stretched endlessly, unbroken, unforgiving. Ahead of him, the horizon waited, a landscape both harsh and familiar. He carried nothing but his gear, his discipline, and the quiet knowledge that he had done what he was trained to do. As SEALs followed his retreating figure with their eyes, understanding dawning fully in a way words could never convey. Respect had been earned not through bravado, not through theatrics, but through action, patience, and the quiet mastery of skill forged by necessity. They would carry the memory of this day, the lesson of the shattered plate, and the silence that followed the echo for the rest of their careers. Carter thought briefly of the distance between what he had done and what the SEALs could imagine. Some men never understood the kind of patience it took to master a long-range shot. Some never understood the weight of responsibility it carried. And some would spend a lifetime chasing perfection that was only possible through relentless dedication. But Carter did not chase it for recognition. He carried it because it had to be carried. The desert sun dipped slightly lower, stretching shadows across the cracked earth. Carter's figure became long, a silhouette against the heat haze, walking steadily, unhurried. Behind him, the scarred steel plate gleamed faintly, a monument not to ego, but to discipline, focus, and responsibility. The SEALs remained, each silently absorbing the impact of what they had witnessed, each internalizing lessons in patience, trust, and respect for the craft. A young SEAL whispered again, almost involuntarily. The plate shattered before the A4. Echo came. This time, the words were not just description. They were affirmation. They were acknowledgement of a mastery that transcended spectacle and entered the realm of the sublime. They were acknowledgement that discipline, patience, and responsibility were more powerful than doubt, arrogance, or disbelief. Carter continued, walking, leaving the desert behind only in body, not in memory. The weight of experience, failure, and triumph traveled with him. An invisible cloak carried silently. Behind him, the SEALs lingered in quiet reflection, the lesson absorbed, not in instruction, but in witness. A day ended not with celebration or applause, but with understanding. The desert returned to stillness, the steel plate remained, and the echo delayed, diminished, but undeniable carried the truth. Mastery was not granted. It was earned, one patient, calculated, and deliberate step at a time. Carter paused briefly, breathing in the dry desert air, feeling the heat and weight of the day settle over him. He thought of the men he had lost, the mistakes he had endured, and the countless hours of preparation that had led to this moment. He knew that, like all true mastery, the shot had been fleeting, but its lesson would endure far longer than the echo. As he disappeared over the ridge, The seals remained behind, staring at the place where the impossible had become reality. The desert, silent and sun-baked, held the memory of the shattered steel plate and the man who had carried the knowledge, patience, and responsibility to make it fall. In that quiet, the truth settled. Some things could not be taught, only witnessed. Some skills could not be explained, only earned. And some men through years of discipline, trust, and sacrifice could make the impossible inevitable. The desert would remember. The steel plate would remember. And the seals, forever changed, would remember the man who walked away without a word, leaving behind a lesson more lasting than the echo of a rifle.